My earliest memory of even discussing my artwork with anybody was with my mother. Of course, by the time we're having this conversation, I was just drawing and drawing and drawing. If you ever needed to keep me occupied, all you had to do was just put a pad of paper and a pencil in front of me, and I would just draw all over every sheet of it. But I remember having this conversation with her, and she had said to me, she said, "You know, your kindergarten teacher remarked that unlike the rest of your classmates, you were the one who was able to draw a fully realized human figure with a head and a neck and 2 arms and 2 legs. And a lot of kids couldn't do that. They would either leave the neck out or the head would be over to one side. But I had everything there that needed to be there. Of course, it wasn't, perfect. I mean, it might have looked more like a Picasso, but nevertheless, for my age, I was already onto something. So, of course, it would stand to reason that by the time I was in 2nd, 3rd grade, I was begging for this book from the Scholastic Book Fair called How to Draw Cartoons by Sid Hoff. He's a famous New Yorker cartoonist, which of course I didn't know at the time. But, of course, once I finally got this book, I sat down and I did all his exercises, and I'm actually thumbing through it right now, and I'm looking at it, I'm like, yeah, this was my style at the time, just because that was all I knew. And of course then I discovered Charlie Brown and the Peanuts Gang, and our school library had hardbound volumes of all of the Peanuts collections, and I would read them cover to cover. And not only that, I would read the comic strips in the newspaper every morning when we got the newspaper. So consequently, I was very moved and inspired to create my own sort of Charlie Brown kind of thing, although that's not what I ended up making. But I did want to do a comic strip of some sort with children, only these children dressed a little more like cosplay adults. And so there was the socialite, and there was the sailor, there was a shopkeeper and a robber, and of course where there was a robber there would be a policeman and a judge, and all sorts of different things like that. And of course then there was Carrie, who was the young girl who was very into the little sailor boy, and much to the aggravation of the socialite, whose name, of course, was Connie, named after my grandmother. and those were my first comic strips that I made, and it was really, it's kind of fun to go back and look at it, but this is just what I was doing. It was just so much fun. Right around that time, I think my focus became infrastructure for some reason. Now, my grandparents lived 2 towns over, and you had to drive through a city to get to their little suburban house. And I was the kind of kid who would just look out the window intently at everything going on. If they were building a bridge, then I had to draw bridges being built. And if we went by a grocery store or a bakery, I would draw those things too. And before you knew it, I was just like spitting out little neighborhood maps. I had the whole route illustrated at one point, and my mother just could not believe that I was just banging these things out. So by the time I got to like 4th and 5th grade, I was making entire cityscapes on these oversized pieces of paper. In fact, I even got one displayed in the elementary school art showcase along with other art class projects, but this one was, I did this completely on my own outside of art class, and the art teacher insisted that she show it off. And looking back at it, I'm really kind of thrilled that she did that for me. Fast forward, I suppose, to the late 70s and the early 80s, and by now I'm becoming exposed to anime, the Japanese cartoons. Star Blazers or Voltron type cartoons where they're a little more on the primitive side compared to the anime that comes out today. Between the anime and the fact that I was also very much a fan of the space race at the time, I was glued to the TV when the Space Shuttle Columbia made its maiden flight, and I collected every newspaper clipping when a space probe did a flyby Jupiter or Saturn or anything like this. So my head was very much in the stars. I mean, I fully expected that in my lifetime we would get to colonize the planets, and so I started drawing comic strips that would sort of tell that story of where we were going as a people. And of course it would have a bit of an anime bent on it, because that's just what I was exposed to and was just soaking it up like a sponge. And I still draw that way today. And I don't think there's really any undoing that at this point. I mean, even when I self-published my own robot comic books or my own superhero comic books, they definitely have that sort of anime bent. Of course, I was doing it back when they would tell you not to put this sort of thing in your portfolio. And I think maybe because by then it had already hit mainstream. I mean, it was everywhere by the time I was in college, and they, were very much advising against putting anything anime in your portfolio. But I had already been drawing that way for 20 years. So, I remember when I was doing these sci-fi comic strips, and I remember doing this one sheet that was nothing but thumbnails of all the different planetary bases that were out there, and they were really very simple. They were nothing complicated. Like, I could take each one of those if I had wanted to and tell a whole story about each one of them, or blow up each individual thumbnail. I mean, these were barely an inch by a quarter or half an inch, and I happened to show that one to my mother. I was probably about 14 at the time. And there was something about that drawing that made her very happy. And she smiled, and I was feeling a little self-conscious about it. And I said, they're just these little drawings, Mom. And she looked at me and she said, will you just keep on doing these little drawings? And I'm glad I listened to her. My name is Dave. My friends call me Skeeter. And I love to draw.